Children of Lear, Part 2. Aoife smiled, an evil and wicked smirk. Then she plunged into the water and covered herself from head to foot, for her plan was to tell everyone that the children had got into difficulty when they were bathing and that they had drowned, and this way it would look as though she had dived in to help save them. She was just about to call the soldiers down to help her with her search, when she noticed the largest of the 4 swans swimming towards her. When it reached the shallows, it spoke. Imagine her horror when she heard the voice, unmistakably that of her niece Fionnuala. For it seems that her magic was not powerful enough to transform the children entirely, and that they had retained the ability to remember and think like a human, and also to speak in human tongues. Fionnuala begged her aunt to change the spell, to recast the spell and change them back. She was bewildered as to why Aoife had done this to them in the first place. After all, the children had shown their aunt nothing but love and affection from the very first moment she had arrived in their hall. And a small nugget of remorse crept into Aoife's stomach. And indeed, she might have reversed the spell there and then, had poor Fionnuala, child as she was, not then said, "You know, of course, our father will search far and wide to find a cure for the curse, and when he finds out that you are responsible for doing this to us, he will never see you again. He will never, ever forgive you for what you have done." Appalling realization of what she had done crept over Niamh and snuffed out the remorse in her stomach, leaving instead just rage and disappointment. She looked at the 4 swans and she said, "Swans you are, and swans you will remain. A curse placed by someone such as myself who has been wronged in love is one that cannot be broken by another. Only I can set you free, and I shall never do that. You will spend 300 years here on this lake, and in that time you will see those whom you love and know perish before you. And when 300 years has passed, your torment will not be over, for you will head east to the wild and stormy seas of Moor, and there you will spend 300 years more. And at the end of that time you will fly back to the west coast of Ireland, where the mighty Atlantic waves pound against the shore, and 300 more years will be your fate to remain as swans. Only when 900 years have passed, and even then only when a king from the north marries the daughter of a king in the south, and their wedding is celebrated by the tolling of bells, only then can the curse be broken." And she turned and left the sad children and strode back to the men. Her plan in tatters, she simply bullied them into doing as she wanted, and they were so afraid of her and her power and what she might do to them and their families that they silently climbed onto their horses, and it was a quiet and sullen group that arrived in Baldor's hall just as the sun was setting. Baldor and his wife were disappointed not to see the children with Aoife, and she was too exhausted to come up with a really decent story to tell them as to why the children weren't there. So instead she simply said that Lear had changed his mind and that he was jealous of how much time they were spending with their grandparents, and from now on they would stay with Lear. Then, exhausted, she retired to her apartments. Baldur was uneasy. Something about the way the men who had accompanied Aoife back to the palace was making him feel uncomfortable. None of them would look at him in the eye, and they shuffled up from foot to foot, and they were very, very quiet. He decided to send a second messenger to Lear and to invite Lear and the children together to join him in Killaloe. When the messenger arrived, Lear was not only puzzled, but he was deeply worried, for he had watched his children ride out less than a week before with his wife. Fearing that there was some sort of trick afoot, he called to his warband and they rode off at top speed towards Killaloe. But when they reached the shores of the lake where the children now lived, even Lear had to admit that the horses needed to rest and to be given a drink. So he stopped there. Full of restless energy, he paced along the shoreline, waiting for the men to give the horses their drinks. And it was then that he noticed 4 swans swimming towards him. When they reached the shallows, the swans called out, and to his astonishment, the voices that he heard were those not of 4 swans, but of his 4 beloved children. Thinking he had misheard it, he waited, and the children called again, and this time their father plunged into the water and put his arms around the 4 swan children. They told him what Aoife had done, and he was filled with anger. He promised them that he would return and break the curse, and then, taking his band, he mounted his horse and he rode post-haste towards Killaloe. He arrived just as the sun was setting, and he strode into Baldur's hall. Baldur looked surprised, and when he saw Lear's face, he knew that something was terribly wrong, for there was no sign of the children, and Lear was positively bristling with rage. He demanded to see Aoife, and while the 2 men waited for her to come, he told his father-in-law all about the wickedness that his stepdaughter had carried out on the children. When Aoife arrived demurely in the hall, she saw her husband standing next to her stepfather, and she knew that her wickedness had been uncovered. She fell to her knees, and Baldur strode towards her. "Is it true, daughter? Is it true what you have done to the beautiful children of Lear, my grandchildren? What wickedness is this? Undo the curse now while you still can." Aoife looked up, and in that moment she caught Lear's glance. She saw there nothing but contempt and hatred, and she knew that the price she was going to have to pay for her jealousy was that she had lost him forever. Determined to hurt him as much as he had hurt her, she looked at her stepfather and she said, "No, I will not do it." Lear reached for his sword, but Baldur held up his hand, and then he strode towards his stepdaughter, and in a voice as cold as ice he said, "I curse you. I curse you with the power of my mother, the goddess Dagda." And he pulled a druid's wand from his own sleeve. "You will become a creature of the air, shunned by men and beasts alike for evermore." And he waved the wand over Aoife's head, and in no time at all she was transformed into an ugly and ragged crony bird that took up through the roof of the fort and disappeared, never to be seen in human form again. Lear and Baldur went back to the lake, and Baldur tried every spell he knew. He called on every druid from the length and breadth of Ireland to try and break the curse, but Aoife was right. The curse was too strong. At last Lear accepted the fact that his children would remain as swans, and he had a house built for himself on the lake shore, and a smaller one for his children. Their grandparents would come in the summer and spend time with them, and every evening father and children would spend time together, telling stories and singing songs. And the songs that the children sang were so beautiful that the people who lived around the lakes began to come themselves to hear it, and soon word had spread far and wide of the singing children. And the story of the children of Lear was retold time and again in fireplaces all around Ireland. But Lear and Baldur, although they were great warriors, were not immortal, and as time went past they grew too old to stay alive, until one day both of them died, and their spirits headed west to the land beyond the setting suns, where their ancestors awaited them. The children were left alone to wait for the passing of the 300 years that would mean the second part of Aoife's curse could run its toll. And that's the end of the second part of the Children of Lear.